Retro.
Hey, this is Catherine Tabor, Senator Padme Amidala from Star Wars The Clone Wars, and you're listening to Jay and Dennis on Podcast Stardust. Stay on the light side.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And we have our lightsabers, and we're starting this week with another discussion of the Clone Wars. But before we get into that, Jay, I want to remind everybody where they can find us on our social media contacts.
Patience, Dennis, patience. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust.
All right, the Just is line, the sizzle is boosted to maximum output. We've identified the scoundrels, the shield is down, we're now broadcasting to the galaxy. This will be our discussion of the Clone Wars from Season 2, Episode 11, which is called Lightsaber Lost. Jay, you want to go ahead and give us a summary of this episode before we get into the details?
Absolutely. When Ahsoka's lightsaber is pickpocketed on the streets of Coruscant, she finds an unlikely ally in her quest to get it back in the form of Elder Jedi Master Tera Sinube. Despite his frail appearance, Master Sinube helps Ahsoka find the culprit, only to discover he had sold the lightsaber to a wanted assassin. From there, Ahsoka and Sinube discovered that the assassin had perished at the hands of two women who flee through the streets and skyways of Coruscant. After a vigorous pursuit, Ahsoka and Sinube corner the women and retrieve Ahsoka's lightsaber.
Yeah. So another classic episode of the Clone Wars. What did you think about this one overall?
Well, of course, it doesn't have, quite the depth or impact as some of the other episodes, especially some of the ones that we've been reviewing here lately has. But always love an Ahsoka-centric Clone Wars episode. And this one obviously is a little bit more about Ahsoka's lessons that need to be learned more so than anything else. And so it's a good episode for her to learn that patience and also to see some of the other kinds of character flaws, I guess you could say, that maybe Ahsoka needs to work through on her own, and how her unlikely ally is featured in this episode. I really liked Master Sinube as well. So overall, not one of my favorite episodes, but it was a good one to relive and revisit. What about you?
Yeah, it's a perfectly good episode. Not one of my favorites either. Dave Filoni called it one of his favorites. And in the featurette that accompanied this one online, he talked about how this was pitched by George Lucas, which I think it's funny. George Lucas pitched it just instead of telling them to do it. But at any rate, the idea is that, you use a lightsaber and you're responsible for everything that happens with it afterwards. So it's also kind of a legacy episode in a way. We know from the Phantom Menace deleted scenes that Obi-Wan lost his lightsaber briefly, got wet, and then didn't function. And then he gets a brief lecture from Qui-Gon about, this weapon is your life. And then in Attack of the Clones, they did include a similar scene where after Anakin lost his lightsaber, Obi-Wan retrieved it, gave it back to him, and then gave Anakin that same lecture. This weapon is your life. You can't lose it. And then the same thing happens here. And at the end of the episode, Ahsoka is telling the younglings that, this weapon's your life and it is your responsibility. And so I kind of like it from that regard, that there's this lineage of Jedi and they pass this lesson down from master apprentice over and over again. And so that's pretty cool. Some neat things that happened here. I actually enjoyed researching this episode a little bit to find out that the story is really kind of fleshed out more after it came out, but we'll get into that as we get through our discussion here. You alluded to it. One of the things that this episode highlights is some of Ahsoka's character flaws. So why don't you expand on that just a little bit?
Well, Ahsoka's always going through an emotional journey, and she's a very young Padawan, and especially in these first couple of seasons of the Clone Wars, And she's learning how to take accountability for herself. She's learning how to adapt to different situations. She's learning responsibility. And, she did a good job at the beginning, I think, owning up to losing her lightsaber to Master Sinube and also to Jocasta Nu, but she doesn't tell Anakin, of course, and I do
Mhm.
think it's funny that, you mentioned that Ahsoka said, "This weapon is my life. I was told not to lose it," but of course, Anakin has lost his how many times? So that plays on what you were saying with the handing down of that legacy, but, she was really kind of brutal in a lot of ways when especially when she was interrogating some of the thugs, if you will, of Coruscant,
Mhm.
in that district that she went down to try to get her lightsaber back. And I think part of that was out of desperation. She wanted
Oh, yes.
wanted so badly to get it back, but she did a good job of adapting. She started the episode really relying on her physical skills and the intimidation that I'm sure she learned from no stranger. But, by the end, she's learning that patience, she's applying deductive reasoning. And, she even at one point connects with a young informant and shows concern for bystanders, kind of thing. So she's kind of all over the place, but it was a good character building, I think, for her episode. But what do you think?
Yeah, she's definitely in the position where she knows the lessons. She knows what she's supposed to do, but living up to that can be a challenge. And we see that with teenagers all the time. And one of the things here that struck me is she had her Luke meets Yoda moment when she first meets Tera Sinube, because she goes to Jocasta Nu to do some research to try and figure out who in the underworld might have actually taken this lightsaber, where they might be, and Jocasta Nu doesn't get anywhere. And so they go to see Tera Sinube, and he's asleep at his console. And like anyone who's a man and middle aged or older, he gives off the excuse, I was just resting my eyes. I've never done that myself. I have no idea what that's like. But at any rate, he wakes up and she immediately discounts him because he was sleeping and he just kind of seems to be bumbling through doing some research until he lands on this image of these Petrolians, which is what Banamu was, the guy that stole her lightsaber. And he's just a little fish looking guy. And, Tera Sinube gives some dad puns, would you say this is fishy? That type
Yes,
of a
that was
thing.
so good.
You're right. And, but then even after he narrows it down, because he is an expert in the underworld there on Coruscant, she's like, no, I got it from here. And and he insists on going with her. And time and again, he proves how capable he is. But just like the way Luke kind of wrote off Yoda in
Mhm.
the first meeting in The Empire Strikes Back, she judged him by his appearance, by his size, by his frailty, by his age on that. And, so yeah, when you talk about how she's got some lessons to learn, that was a big one in this episode.
That's a great comparison, and I had not thought about that comparison to, Luke and Yoda until just now. So, hats off. That was a good one.
Of course. Thank you. And then, as you alluded to, when it comes to the interrogation of Banamu, she raises a fist to him. And
Mhm.
Tera Sinube has to kind of call her off there. This is not the first time this has happened in this series. It's like not the second time either. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, it's again, it's part of that desperation and that frustration that she's feeling because she knows she's got so many different types of expectations on her and she doesn't want to disappoint. But yet she's not expressing them in the greatest of Jedi ways to try to get down to the bottom of what her needs are. And I think part of that is just her immaturity, as a teenager, but I also think that again, some of that is, as I mentioned earlier, she doesn't learn that from any stranger. She's seen Anakin do similar things to, interrogate or, deal with the different types of situations. So I think that's part of it as well.
Yeah, and I think this scene is a good reminder that as much as we all love Ahsoka, and as you've talked about previously on this podcast, she's a character that was introduced to us as kind of an annoying little brat. And she grew on us over time. She evolved, she matured, but she's frequently lauded as like this perfect example of what a Jedi should be. Well,
Hmm.
that's not always the case. She's not human, but you know what I mean when I say she's human. She's imperfect. She makes mistakes. She will do things that she regrets later. We see that all the way in Rebels when she's reacting to what she thinks might be Anakin's presence when they encounter Darth Vader and and she doesn't say anything or doesn't speak up to anybody. She has regrets throughout her life. And while she ends up later in life handling a lot of things in a more ideal fashion, she's not flawless. And I think it is a disservice to her character and her journey for us to kind of hold her up as this like pure example of what a Jedi should be at all times because she
Oh,
wasn't
yeah.
always that. I mean, she has her flaws.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, and I think the first flaw in this episode was her mindset of believing that as a Jedi, her authority will keep her safe, because
Hmm.
she even pats her lightsaber, like, okay,
Right.
I've got this kind of thing.
Yeah. Move
And so,
along.
yeah, so it causes her to let her guard down. And, even though she's in a position of control and power, she was very much caught unaware of the chaos of real life.
Mhm.
And so it shows that she's not prepared or perfect all the time.
What did you think of her decision not to tell Anakin?
I'm kind of surprised at that because she's always been able to, at least up to this point, go to Anakin with everything. I mean, when she lost her clone troopers in battle, he was the one that talked to her about it and basically consoled her and counseled her about that. So it was a little surprising to me that she didn't go to Anakin and wasn't completely honest with him about what had happened, and she was covering it up until she got down to the archives and
Mhm.
was seeking other help. But I think part of that too is, again, she didn't want to let Anakin down and she wanted to prove that she was responsible. But to me, that really places a lot of emphasis on how important, and I understand that the lightsaber is important. It is important. It's a Jedi's weapon and it's part of who they are. And they go through a whole process to build it and make it their own. And definitely a symbol of the Jedi in and of themselves. But it's almost like, in a way, is it too much of a stress on that importance of the lightsaber to make it so she couldn't go to him? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah, I got a couple thoughts with regard to that. I mean, one, you're right, given how understanding Anakin has been. I mean, he's called her out when he's needed to. He's got his own flaws. I mean, he's not flawless either, but I think, over the course of the first season and a half of this, he's been a pretty good master when it
Right.
comes down to it there. And it's at some point we're all like disappointed. We all don't want to disappoint our parents, and obviously he's not her father, but it is a mentor mentee relationship, a parent child type of relationship in a way. Obi-Wan says when you've been to the Sith to Anakin, I raised you since you were a small boy, and there is some parental type of pride that comes in that. And the last thing you want to do is disappoint somebody in that type of position, but that's what they're there for, right? I mean, they mentor you through these type of things. They guide you, they counsel you through this. And so for her not to tell him, on the one hand, surprising, but I can also remember as a teenager when I made some goofs, it's like, if I can fix this without letting my parents know, that's the way I want
Sure.
to deal with this. And
Exactly.
we've all been there. And so I get that. But it is there is just kind of but she went to Jocasta and then she's talking to Tera Sinube like, you're counting on these people to keep this quiet and for some it not to get back to Anakin. And that's an incredible gesture of trust to do
Mhm.
in that situation.
It
So,
is.
yeah. Okay. Well, so she and Tara Sinube go out to track down the lightsaber, and we've already talked a little bit about the interrogation. Once they found Banamu, they go to a kind of a street vendor type of food place, and then they get the lead on what they need. And she's kind of throwing her weight around there as well. You're talking about things where it kind of calls her judgment into question a little bit. But then, she interrogates Banamu, and then she finds out that the weapon was sold to a Trandoshan named Knack Movers. I was really hoping to find that there was a story behind that name, because doesn't it
Right.
seem like there would be something? But
It does seem like there should be.
right. My research turned up nothing. But when they get to his apartment, he's dead. He's lying on the floor. He's been killed, and kind of hiding in the shadows is this woman named Ione Marce, who is at least that's how I pronounced it. How did you pronounce her name?
Oh, that sounds right. Ione
Okay.
Marseille. Mhm.
Right. And she is a Salinga female, very unusual looking person. Her eyes aren't horizontal, they're vertical.
Right.
And that kept throwing me off, probably
Mhm.
more than anything I've seen out of an alien in a long time.
I agree. Yes, and because you're not used to that weird way that the eyes opened and closed, and even her mouth was a little off-putting too. So, and I
Mhm.
think too the irises being so green was another thing. But yeah, very interesting
Yeah,
character.
and so she was voiced by Meredith Salinger, who did the voice of Barra Safie in the Clone Wars. And until I looked that up today to get ready for the show, I was like, "This is driving me nuts. Where have I heard this voice before?"
Mm.
It's like, is it Cat Tabor? Is who? And it obviously was not, but it was, anyway. So it was fun to discover that. But uh, Ione Marcy tells Ahsoka that she it's like these men came in and they killed him, and as the episode carries on, Tera Sinube kind of points out it's like not much of evidence of a struggle in here for a bunch of men that came in, and of course what we come to find out is that Ione Marcy and then Cassie Cryar, who is a Terrelian Jango Jumper, conspired to kill neck movers, and they took the lightsaber for themselves. So, what'd you make of these two, Ione and Cassie?
Well, again, like you just said, Ione is very, very unsettling, but I always did like the idea of Cassie Cryar. She was so lithe and so feline in nature, and the way that she was able to out jump and with the physicality that she had in the chase that Ahsoka gave, after her.
Mhm.
I always thought that was super cool, but I always wondered what end did she want the lightsaber? Just to be able to sell it again? Because she seemed really intent on feeling like it almost seemed like there was a more intense purpose for her to want that lightsaber. Did you pick up on that?
Yeah, and if you go to Wikipedia, they cite to a bunch of sources on these two, and I was kind of talking about how this story's been fleshed out subsequently to its airing here. And the backstory to all of this is that Ione Marcy is Nat Moore's girlfriend, an odd pairing. He's a Trandoshan, she's this Salinga, and he's enormous, and she's much smaller. And Cassie Cryars, whose first name is actually Cassilita, it was a known mercenary that had some skills, and a bunch of people wanted to get to Knack Movers because he is this reputable assassin, and he tends to kill his victims with poison. And so Cassie moves into their apartment, and at some point, Knack propositions her, and this doesn't go over well with anybody. So Cassie and Ione conspire to get him out of the way. And I think it was as much about getting him out of the way as it was the lightsaber. And the fact that he had this lightsaber was almost kind of fortuitous for them. It's something that she could use if she wanted as a weapon. And we already learned earlier in the episode that it was worth 20,000 credits on the black
Mhm.
market, if not more. So it's a potential source of wealth for these two as well. And so again, it seems like they really invested in the backstory of this episode when it came down to it. I was surprised to hear that not that they put thought into it, but they put as much thought into it as all this.
Yeah, because we don't really see that much backstory put into a lot of these different types of characters, but that's super cool. And I could see that
Mhm.
she wanted it, especially in the underworld. It's not only worth something, but it's also a symbol of power, and prestige. especially
Mhm.
being able to say that you own a lightsaber from a Jedi.
Yeah. I think the other thing that comes down to it is there's just a little bit of social commentary here where, when it comes to Ione, she's kind of been at the mercy of knack movers all this time. And
Mhm.
then Cassie gets brought into this. Those two develop a relationship that's suggested in the subsequent material. Star Wars Common Villainy Case Files of the Galaxy's Most Notorious was one of the ones that they quoted quite a lot on the Wikipedia
Mm,
page, is
okay.
that these two had developed a relationship of their own, some sort of romantic relationship here. And so all of this was their escape. And they're living in the lower levels of Coruscant where things going on in 100 levels, 200, 300, 1,000 levels above them, where the rich, the wealthy, the famous, the important people are, and they never take notice of what's going on in these lower
Mhm.
levels. And so this is this is an escape. This is an opportunity for them to get to some sort of different life when it comes down to it. And so, yeah, when we were talking about desperation for Ahsoka to get the lightsaber, there's desperation on their part. This may be their ticket out of here at the end of the
Oh,
day.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. That's true.
Mhm.
And you know what just hit me too is that this in some way mirrors the oh shoot, their names just escaped me. The sisters in season 7,
The Martez
the
sisters.
Martez sisters, that Ahsoka ends up befriending. So it's
Mhm.
it's kind of a weird mirror image of that in some ways.
Yeah, everyone's running a racket. Everyone's got their goal and their vision and their dream of getting out from the underworld, these lower levels, and this was their opportunity, so they acted on it and ended up putting a lot of people in danger in the process. But
Right.
so there is this pursuit through the the streets, the alleys, the skyway of Coruscant with Cassie doing these incredible feats of jumping. Now, we called her a Terrelian Jango Jumper. That's the name of the species. I don't know that Jango Jumper. I did think it was funny that Jango was in the name
Right.
since that is the template for the clones. But uh, she was based off of a concept that Ian McKay came up with for the Sith in the Phantom Menace. So what was Darth Maul was going to be, and I so wish I could get my hands on the Art of book for the Phantom Menace, but I couldn't find it to see that because I remember seeing that before, and it completely jogged my memory when I saw that. But while Ahsoka's in pursuit, Tera Sinube is kind of taking the slow route. He stays behind with Ione and kind of talks to her and he gets the truth out of her and then plants a tracker on her back so that when she flees, leads them right to Cassie. They get on a train. There's a showdown there. You kind of made an allusion to that. But one of my favorite parts of this whole pursuit is that there's these billboards that Cassie is jumping across and Ahsoka's pursuing her, and then Cassie keeps like disabling them so that they fall out of alignment while they're hovering there. But one of them is a big video presentation of Palpatine giving a speech, and he's talking about how there's these rumors going around that the Jedi engineered the Clone Wars in order to consolidate power, but he's here to refute that. He won't stand for these rumors that the Jedi are fighting bravely for the galaxy. And I was like, that was genius. I
Yes.
loved that little thing that they included in here because it so goes to set up everything Palpatine says in Revenge of the Sith.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's so great too to see how there's that type of visual representation of Ahsoka looking like this little ant
Mhm.
on Palpatine's image. And I thought, oh, how is that totally foreshadowing how the Jedi end up being seen against the might of Palpatine and the Empire? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and then the contrast is the Zillo Beast episode. When the Zillo Beast is, like,
Oh,
rampaging
yeah.
through Coruscant, and he sees this big image of Palpatine talking on a giant screen, and he attacks it. And so,
That's
you know,
right.
you have the giant monster in one of these episodes, you have the tiny little Ahsoka in another.
Mhm. That's
So
great. Love that. Yeah, and now that you mentioned the, concept for the Darth Maul type Sith in The
mhm.
Phantom Menace, I remember seeing that now because that was one of the first images that was brought out, and it was considered too scary. Is
Yeah,
that the one you're referring to?
there's
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yes, there was a lot of great concept arts there, even including a child type character. I remember
Mhm.
if you watch some of the making of the Phantom Menace, and George Lucas looked at that and says like, "Oh, we clearly have some parents here in the art team." But some fun comments from George Lucas when it comes to the making of the Phantom Menace there. Then we get the scene during the pursuit where Cassie finally gets cornered on the train, and she takes a Twi'lek woman and her daughter hostage, and Ahsoka tries to make a deal with her, release them and take me. You know how valuable I am. The Jedi will pay a lot more for me here. And so we just kind of commented on Ahsoka's flaws, but that was a very mature, brave thing for her to do in that position.
It was indeed, and the only drawback to that, though, is how is she going to explain to Anakin how she ended up in that position, or to the rest of, the Jedi Council or whatever for that matter? Because obviously this was a snowball type of situation that was happening to her, and again, I think it was more out of almost desperation to get her lightsaber back, and I do
Sure.
believe that she wanted to save the mom and her daughter as well. But then again, it was also a last ditch effort to try to get that back.
Well, and I think, for the criticisms that we had of Ahsoka, I also think that she is wise enough to know where it's one thing for her to go behind Anakin's back to try and get back this lightsaber, but when people's lives are on the lines, she's got to do
Right.
the right thing
Oh
when
yeah,
it
for
when
sure.
it comes down to it. And so that's what she's doing. She is taking to heart the lesson that comes at the end of this episode, which is this lightsaber is your life and it's also a responsibility. And so, she knows that she's responsible for the situation, that Cassie is now threatening people with her lightsaber. And while it was theoretical that Cassie could do some damage with this before, Ahsoka's pursuit is making Cassie do desperate things, including threaten the lives of these two people in
Mhm.
this moment here. And so she has to do something to defuse the situation.
Mhm. No, it's true.
Yeah.
Good point.
And then of course, Tera Sinube proves that, slow and steady wins the race, and he shows up there as the train comes to a stop and then pulls a lightsaber out of his little walking stick and disarms her and smacks her with a stick. So kind of like that
Nice.
moment as well. So
Very
um
cool.
yeah, it's funny like this. I can't remember if we see Tera Sinube again in the Clone Wars, but do you remember seeing his fate? What ultimately happened to him?
Oh yeah, wasn't he frozen? Was it in the Inquisitorius or what?
Right, yeah. In the
Okay.
Obi-Wan Kenobi series, when they get to the Fortress Inquisitorius,
Yes.
we see him encased in something. I'm not entirely sure what it is amongst the collection of Jedi that the Inquisitors had there in their palace.
Mhm. Yes, poor Master Sinube.
Yeah.
The more we talk about him, the more I really like him, and I'd forgotten about him in a lot of ways, other than again seeing him here and there in the Clone Wars and then later on. But he really does represent deeper Jedi ideals if you think about it.
Right.
Because he's done things like, he tells Ahsoka, I find that often the more patient approach will lead you to the answer. So he's about patience. He watches, he listens, his calmness is in discipline. He's not passive, but he has discipline. And they've often said that, the Jedi are meant to be guardians of the peace, not warriors. And Sunube actually embodies that, quite well.
Yeah, he showed up in the, previous episode to this, in that cameo or a
Mhm.
previous episode in here when the, 2 episodes ago when the Jedi Council was looking at that hollow of Grievous basically threatening Master Eth Koth.
Mhm.
And so he
Right.
was there, he was in the background. This episode was actually produced first, but that's where the
Oh,
model,
interesting.
yeah, according to the trivia guide on the episode guide for this on StarWars.com, it's one of the things they noted here. No, I liked him quite a bit. It's one of those characters where I almost kind of slipped into some of the same prejudice Ahsoka had, which is like, here's this dawdling old Jedi, and then he narrows it down. It's like, any of these look familiar, and then he finds the guy that stole the lightsaber, and then his gentle wisdom and his patience, because they're on that bark speeder. And Ahsoka is like riding on the back. It's like, can you speed it up a bit, Gramps? She
Right.
actually calls him Gramps
Ramps,
in this
yes.
episode. And
Oh
it's
my
kind of
god.
like that's
A
a
little disrespectful.
well, especially for Ahsoka, because I don't remember her really being that. Well, now that I say that, I mean, she did tell Admiral Yularen, cool your jets. And so she is
Yeah.
prone to do that. But that's almost a derogatory term, is
Mhm.
opposed to just kind of a retort, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, it's not really out of character though, because
Mhm.
from the get-go, she called Anakin Sky Guy. So, she's always and that's why she's called Snips. She's always had these
Yeah,
little
but Sky
cheeky,
Guy is kind of an
comments.
affectionate nickname compared to
Mhm.
Gramps was kind of like she's saying when you hear that word being used these days, it's someone younger typically someone younger putting down an older person because they're slow, get out of the way, I don't need your help. That
Good
type
point.
of a thing.
Mm,
And that's the way she said it in this episode.
that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yep. Good point. Good point. What I do like about Master Sinube, though, and I wish that we would see more of the lightsaber and the cane thing. That was so cool. But he not only helped her find her lightsaber, he helped her find her center. You know what I mean?
Right.
And he really taught her to slow down, which I thought was great.
Didn't Maul do that in Rebels? Didn't he have his lightsaber hidden in the staff?
Oh, I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not the last time I see this
Yeah.
type of a thing. Um, but
From a
then
Jedi.
right, right. Yeah, but then the final scene we get here is that they return to the Jedi Temple and uh Sinube and Ahsoka are walking down the hall. She's thanking him for his help. And then he says that he's got he's got a favor to ask of her. And they end up in a training room where Yoda is giving some instruction to some younglings. And it's almost like Sinube set this up in advance because as soon as they wander in, the kids all take off their helmets and Yoda says to Ahsoka, like, Padawan, Tano, do you have something to say? And then she offers that lesson about,
Yes.
this lightsaber is your life and it's also your responsibility there. So, yeah, I mean, again, I'm with you, Jay. As you said at the top of the episode, this isn't necessarily one of my favorites, but it is a neat, tidy little standalone episode. It's fun. It's a
Mhm.
good little episode, and it's got a neat little message there or a couple of neat messages there about not taking for granted your elderly there. And, two, if you're going to use something as powerful as a lightsaber, you have to take that responsibility seriously
Right.
when it comes down to it. And so, yeah, it's fun. I enjoyed this one.
Yeah, same. And it goes back to that fortune cookie. Easy isn't always simple.
Exactly. All right. Well, then, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this episode up. Thank you for joining us for the episode of Podcast Stardust and our discussion of the Lightsaber Lost episode of our Clone Wars rewatch. We hope you've enjoyed it. And if you did and you haven't done so already, and why wouldn't you have, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Help us out. You'll get all these future discussions of the Clone Wars downloaded for you automatically every Monday. That's when we've been putting them out. And then if you want to catch some more of our back episodes beyond the ones that might be on your podcatcher, head over to retrozapp.com where our entire catalog of shows can be found. And then if you want to talk to us, reach out on social media. Jay, you want to go ahead and remind everybody what our social media contacts are?
Absolutely. So we are very easily found on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust, and you don't even have to look at a billboard on Coruscant to find that. We also have all of our Pinterest boards as well as our two YouTube outlets, so you can hit up all of our episodes on both the traditional YouTube as well as YouTube Music. So please head over to both, like, subscribe, share those out, and share those with your friends, please. And we also have our T Public store, which has 7 different show logo designs available on all kinds of things from home goods to apparel and everything in between. No lightsabers, though, so you won't find one there. And we also have a link in our show notes where you can make sure to click on or copy and paste into your browser and you can shop to your heart's content.
All right. Do you want to remind everybody where they can find you and your cosplay adventures?
Sure. So speaking of Ahsoka, you can find me as Ahsoka from seasons 3 through 6, actually, of the Clone Wars, as well as my two different versions of Hera, Fourth Sister, Leia, my Mandalorian, all very conveniently on Instagram at j.snipscosplay.
All right, upcoming on the show on Wednesday, we're getting back into some High Republic comics with a discussion of Fear of the Jedi issues 1 and 2. And then on Friday, we get back into the news, discussing the latest in the galaxy from far, far away. And if there's no news, we'll find something else to talk about, but we'll see. Just make sure you subscribe to the podcast, then you'll get that episode when it comes out. With all that said, thanks for listening to episode 909 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great week, and until next time, may the Force be with you.